I bought my husband for $1, but I didn't know he owned the city. Moon Jae-in, the ruthless Viper CEO, didn't want a marriage. She wanted a human shield. To humiliate her murderous stepmother and reclaim her throne, she dragged her poor country bumpkin bodyguard, Nam-gil, to the altar. She treated him like a dog, mocking his silence and making him sign a contract that forbade him from ever speaking to her in public. She thought she was the ultimate puppet master, using a nobody to fight her billion-dollar war of revenge. But she made one fatal mistake. She never checked his background. As her enemies moved in for the kill at the wedding, the city's most dangerous generals and elite billionaires didn't look at her. They fell to their knees before her poor husband. Moon Jae-in stood frozen in her white lace gown, the realization hitting her like a bullet. The man she'd been treating like a servant for 3 years wasn't just a bodyguard. He was the legendary Godfather of the city, and he hadn't been following her orders. He had been allowing her to play queen while he burned her enemies alive from the shadows. The golden chandelier of the Moon Group's boardroom cast a cold, sharp light over the mahogany table. Moon Jae-in sat at the head, her face an unreadable mass of ice. Across from her, Mrs. Park, her stepmother, adjusted her pearl necklace with a triumphant smirk. The woman's eyes glittered with a malice that had been years in the making. "You've always been so proud, Jae-in," Mrs. Park purred, sliding a thick legal document across the table. "But your father knew your heart was too cold for business. That's why he added the final codicil. To inherit the chairman's seat and majority shares, you must be married within 30 days. If not, everything, this building, the legacy, the power, transfers to your sister, So-yoon." The room went silent. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Jae-in's fingers tightened under the table, but she didn't blink. She knew this was a trap. Mrs. Park had already picked out a cruel business rival to marry Jae-in off to, a man who would break her spirit and take her wealth. "The 30 days are almost up," Mrs. Park continued, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Since you have no one, I've taken the liberty of—" "I don't need your help, Mrs. Park," Jae-in interrupted. Her voice was like a blade. "I am already engaged." Laughter erupted from the other side of the table. "Engaged? To whom? You haven't left this office in months." Jae-in stood up, her heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor as she walked toward the door. She pushed it open, revealing a tall, silent figure standing in the shadows of the hallway. He was dressed in a simple, dark suit, his posture rigid and disciplined. It was Nam-gil, the man who had stood 3 paces behind her for 3 years, carrying her bags and opening her doors. "Meet my fiancé," Jae-in announced, her voice echoing with a forced sweetness that chilled the room. The board members gasped. Mrs. Park's face turned a violent shade of red. "The bodyguard? You're marrying a servant? A country bumpkin with no name?" Nam-gil stepped into the light. He didn't look like a man out of place. He looked like a predator entering a room full of prey. He didn't say a word, but his gaze locked onto Mrs. Park with such intensity that she instinctively stepped back. Jae-in reached out and took Nam-gil's hand. His skin was warm and calloused, a stark contrast to her own cold palm. "He has a name," Jae-in said, looking directly at her stepmother. "And soon he will have the Moon Group's protection. We're registering the marriage tomorrow." Mrs. Park trembled with rage, but Jae-in had already won the first round. She was using a nobody to save her kingdom. She didn't realize that by bringing the silent bodyguard into her bed, she had just handed the keys of her empire to the most dangerous man in the city. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung shut, leaving Jae-in and Nam-gil alone in the dim hallway. Jae-in immediately dropped his hand, the warmth of his touch lingering like an unwanted ghost on her skin. She didn't look at him as she began walking toward her private office, her heels clicking like a countdown. "Inside," she commanded, once behind the soundproof glass of her office. Jae-in turned to face the man who was now officially her fiancé. Nam-gil stood by the door, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression as flat and unreadable as a stone wall to the world. He was a servant she had plucked from the dirt. To her, he was a shield she intended to use until it shattered. She sat at her desk and pulled a checkbook from the drawer. With a sharp, practiced motion, she scribbled a figure that would make most people's hearts stop. She ripped the paper out and slid it across the polished surface. $10 million, Jae-in said, her voice cold and businesslike. That is for the first year. You will act as my husband in public. You will move into the manor. You will follow my every order without question. Once I have the chairman's seat, we divorce, and you get another $10 million to disappear forever. Nam-gil looked at the check. He didn't move. He didn't even lean in to count the zeros. I don't want your money, Miss Moon, he said quietly. Jae-in's eyes narrowed. Don't be greedy, Nam-gil. This is more than you would earn in 10 lifetimes as a bodyguard. If you think you can negotiate for more. I want $1, Nam-gil interrupted. Jae-in froze. Excuse me, $1 would make the contract legal, he said, stepping closer to the desk. His presence suddenly felt much larger, casting a long shadow over her paperwork. My loyalty cannot be bought, Jae-in. It can only be given. I will protect you because I choose to, not because of the bank balance. Jae-in stared at him, searching for a hidden trick or a glimmer of a secret plan. But she saw nothing but steady, calm eyes. A wave of irritation washed over her. In her world, money was the only thing that made people predictable. By refusing the millions, he had become a variable she couldn't calculate. She scoffed, leaning back in her leather chair. Fine. If you want to be a fool, be a fool. I suppose a man from the countryside wouldn't even know how to spend that much money anyway. She viewed his refusal as a sign of low ambition, the simple mindset of a man who was content to be a pawn. She reached into her purse, tossed a single gold coin onto the desk, and watched it spin before coming to a rest. There is your payment, she said dismissively. Go pack your things. You're moving into the Moon Estate tonight. Nam-gil picked up the coin and tucked it into his pocket. He bowed slightly, the ghost of a knowing smile touching his lips. He knew what she didn't. He already owned the city she was fighting for. He didn't need her millions. He only wanted her. The morning of Jae-in's first official board meeting as chairwoman-elect was a disaster. She paced her office, her phone buzzing incessantly with reports of a total logistics collapse. By sunrise, Mrs. Park had made her move. Every shipping company associated with the Moon Group had abruptly canceled their contracts, citing unforeseen technical delays. It was a blatant act of sabotage designed to make Jae-in look incompetent before the directors. Without those shipping lines, the company's global exports would freeze, costing them millions by noon. She's trying to strangle me, Jae-in hissed, staring at the blank tracking monitors in the command center. If those ships don't move in the next 3 hours, the board will vote me out before I even take the seat. Nam-gil stood by the window, his back to her. He seemed strangely detached, his eyes fixed on the bustling harbor in the distance. To Jae-in, he looked like a useless statue, a man who had no understanding of the high-stakes war she was fighting. I told you this would be dangerous, she snapped at him. Do you even understand what's happening? We are losing everything. I understand, Miss Moon, Nam-gil said quietly. He reached into his pocket and sent a single, short text message. It wasn't a plea or a business proposal. It was an order. While Jae-in frantically called every contact in her directory, something impossible began to happen across the city. In the dark offices of the city's most powerful logistics firms, phones began to ring. Men in expensive suits turned pale as they received instructions from a block number. At the docks, the port authorities suddenly cleared every lane. By the time the board meeting began, Mrs. Park was wearing a triumphant smile. She stood up, ready to deliver the killing blow. It seems our young heiress has already cost us our shipping network, she announced to the directors. Clearly, she is unfit. The doors burst open. An executive rushed in, breathless, and holding a tablet. The ships, they're moving. Not just ours. Every independent carrier in the harbor has pivoted to prioritize Moon Group cargo. They're giving us a 90% discount on fuel and priority docking." The room fell into a shocked silence. Mrs. Park's smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure confusion. Jae-in stared at the screen, her heart racing. It was a miracle. It was as if the entire city had collectively decided to serve her interests overnight. She glanced toward the back of the room, where Nam-gil stood against the wall. He remained as silent and humble as ever, his eyes downcast. Jae-in shook her head, dismissing the thought. There was no way her $1 husband had anything to do with this. She simply assumed her father's old allies had finally stepped up. She turned back to board, her voice regaining its icy edge. "It seems your information is outdated, Mrs. Park. Shall we continue?" The following week, Jae-in was forced to attend the launch of a high-end jewelry boutique. It was a den of vipers, filled with the city's elite who were all waiting to see the bodyguard husband up close. She walked into the store with her head held high, her hand resting stiffly on Nam-gil's arm. He wore a plain, dark suit he had bought years ago. To Jae-in, he looked neat, but to the crowd of socialites, he looked like a stain on the silk carpet. "Oh, Jae-in, is this the one?" A shrill voice rang out. It was her half-sister, Seo-yoon, flanked by a group of laughing heiresses. They surrounded the couple, their eyes scanning Nam-gil with disgusted amusement. "I heard you married a servant, but I didn't think he'd actually show up in polyester. Does he even know which fork to use? Or does he eat with his hands in the countryside?" The group erupted in giggles. Jae-in felt a flash of hot shame, her grip tightening on Nam-gil's sleeve. She wanted to snap back, to defend her choice, but the weight of their judgment fell heavy. Nam-gil, however, didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a distant point, ignoring the insults as if they were nothing more than buzzing flies. "Security should really be more careful about who they let in," Seo-yoon continued, waving a hand at Nam-gil's suit. "This is a luxury event, not a discount warehouse. You're embarrassing the Moon family name, Jae-in." While the women laughed, Nam-gil reached into his pocket and sent a 3-word text. Less than 5 minutes later, the store manager's phone rang. His face went pale as he listened, his eyes darting toward Nam-gil in pure terror. He dropped the phone and practically sprinted across the showroom. "Out! Everyone out!" the manager shouted, startling the crowd. He marched straight to Seo-yoon and her friends. "Your memberships have been revoked. You are banned from this boutique and every affiliate worldwide. Leave immediately." "What? Do you know who I am?" Seo-yoon shrieked. "I know exactly who you are," the manager barked. "And the owner has made it clear that your presence insults our most VIP guests." Security guards appeared, physically ushering the stunned socialites toward the door. The store became silent. The manager turned to Jae-in and Nam-gil, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. He signaled to an assistant, who brought out a velvet box containing the Eternal Star, a blue diamond worth $50 million. "Please, Miss Moon," the manager trembled. "The owner insists you take this as a gift for the inconvenience. It is the only piece in the world worthy of your beauty." Jae-in stared at the diamond, then at the terrified manager. She looked at Nam-gil, who simply adjusted his cufflink, his face as calm as a quiet sea. "The owner," she whispered. "Who is the owner?" "A man who values true loyalty, Miss Moon," Nam-gil said softly, his voice a low rumble. "Shall we go? This place has become quite boring." As they walked out, Jae-in felt a shiver of realization. Her cheap husband was becoming the most expensive mystery of her life. The following night, the air in the city turned thick and cold. Jae-in was working late in her home office, the desk light casting long, tired shadows against the walls. She was exhausted, but the war for her father's company never slept. Suddenly, the heavy silence was broken by the sound of glass shattering downstairs. Jae-in froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she reached for a heavy letter opener. She stood up, her eyes darting to the security monitors on her desk. The screens were black. Someone had cut the wires. She stepped out into the hallway, her breath shallow. At the bottom of the grand staircase, four men in dark hoodies stood like specters. One of them held a thick stack of papers, the deeds of the Moon Group's primary land holdings. In his other hand was a jagged hunting knife. "Chairman Choi sends his regards, Miss Moon," the lead thug growled, his voice a gravelly threat. "Sign the deeds and you might keep your life. Refuse, and we'll make sure you're buried next to your father." Jae-in gripped the letter opener, her knuckles white. She was a viper, but she was outnumbered and trapped. "I will never sign," she said, her voice trembling despite her pride. "Then you've made your choice," the man sneered, lunging forward. Before he could reach the first step, a shadow detached itself from the darkness behind him. It was Nam-gil. He didn't shout or call for help. He moved with a terrifying, silent speed that Jae-in had never seen before. In a single fluid motion, he caught the attacker's wrist. There was a sickening crack, and the knife clattered to the floor. Nam-gil didn't stop. He spun, his elbow connecting with the second man's jaw, sent him flying across the marble foyer. The remaining two thugs pulled out metal pipes, but they were too slow. Nam-gil moved like a ghost, his strikes precise and lethal. He wasn't just defending, he was dismantling them. Within seconds, the four men were sprawled on the floor, groaning and unable to move. Nam-gil stood in the center of the wreckage, his breathing perfectly calm. There wasn't a single scratch on his dark suit. He looked down at the thugs with eyes that were no longer those of a humble guard, but of a king who had just crushed a minor rebellion. He picked up the fallen land deeds and walked up the stairs toward Jae-in. He stopped 2 steps below her, maintaining the distance of a servant, yet the energy radiating from him was overwhelming. He held out the papers. "The threat has been neutralized, Miss Moon," he said, his voice low and steady. Jae-in looked at the papers, then at his hands, steady and strong. She realized then that a country boy didn't know how to fight like a professional executioner. She had hired him to be her shield, but she was beginning to realize she had brought a storm into her house. "Who are you, Nam-gil?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am your husband," he replied, his gaze locking onto hers with a depth that made her heart race for an entirely different reason. "And no one in this city will touch you again." Driven by a growing unease, Jae-in decided to verify Nam-gil's story herself. She told him she wanted to see where he grew up, expecting to find a dusty, forgotten shack in the middle of nowhere. She imagined a place that would confirm her belief that he was just a simple man from the countryside who had gotten lucky. As her sleek black sedan rolled into the valley where the village was tucked away, Jae-in's eyes widened. This wasn't a collection of shacks. The roads were perfectly paved, the buildings were modern yet elegant, and the air felt strangely still, as if the entire mountain was standing guard. When they stepped out of the car, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The villagers, who had been busy with their daily lives, stopped in their tracks. They didn't wave casually or call out his name like an old friend. Instead, they moved the sides of the road, clearing a path. Men in their 60s bowed their heads deeply, and women clutched their children, looking at Nam-gil with a mixture of profound gratitude and fear. "Welcome home, sir," an elderly man whispered, his voice trembling with respect as they passed. Jae-in watched in stunned silence. She had expected to see Nam-gil's humble beginnings. Instead, she felt like she was walking through a royal court. No one looked at her, the billionaire heiress. Every eye was fixed on a man she had bought for $1. They walked toward a large, traditional estate at the top of the hill. As they entered, a row of men in dark suits, identical to the ones who had attacked her house, but far more disciplined, straightened their backs and bowed in perfect unison. "Is this your family?" Jae-in asked, her voice small against the weight of the silence. "These people are my responsibility," Nam-gil replied. His voice was no longer the soft tone of a bodyguard. It held the resonance of a leader. He didn't look at the men bowing to him. He kept his eyes on the path ahead, guiding Jae-in with a steady hand. Jae-in looked around, seeing the high-tech security cameras hidden in the ancient trees, and the way the villagers moved with the precision of trained soldiers. The realization hit her like a physical blow. He wasn't a country boy who had made it to the city. He was a king who had stepped down from his throne just to stand behind her. "You didn't grow up here," she whispered, stopping him. "You built this. You own this entire place, don't you?" Nam-gil turned to her, the wind ruffling his dark hair. For a moment, the mask of the servant slipped entirely, revealing a gaze so sharp it made her breath catch. "I told you, Jae-in, I have the resources to protect what is mine. And right now you are mine." For the first time, Jae-in felt the true scale of the man she had married. She wasn't the master of a puppet. She was the guest of a lion. The return from a village was silent, but the air between them had changed. That night, the moon estate felt colder than usual. Jae-in tossed and turned in her silk sheets, her mind haunted by the images she had tried so hard to bury. In her dream, she was back in the rain, watching her father's car tumble off the cliff. She could hear his voice calling her name, feel the heat of the flames, and see the shadowy figure of Mrs. Park smiling in the distance. Jae-in woke up with a silent scream, her body drenched in a cold sweat. Her heart was thumping so hard it felt like it would crack her ribs. For years, she had faced these terrors alone, locking herself in the bathroom until the sun came up. But as she sat up, gasping for air, she saw a steady glow from the corner of the room. Nam-gil was sitting in a chair by the window. He wasn't sleeping. He was watching the door, his hand resting near his jacket, ever the sentry. Seeing her distress, he stood up and walked to the edge of the bed. He didn't reach out to touch her. He knew her boundaries too well, but his presence felt like a warm blanket against the frost of her nightmare. "It was just a memory, Jae-in," he said softly. His voice was a low, soothing hum that acted like an anchor for her drifting mind. "The past cannot hurt you while I am here." Jae-in looked up at him, her eyes wide and wet with tears she refused to let fall. Usually, she would have snapped at him to leave. She would have reminded him of his place. But tonight, the ice around her heart felt dangerously thin. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and grazed the sleeve of his shirt. "Stay," she whispered, "just for tonight. Don't go back to the shadows." Nam-gil sat on the edge of the bed, his weight making the mattress sink. He took her hand in his. His palm was broad and calloused, the hand of a man who had seen violence. Yet he held her fingers as if they were made of the finest glass. He began to tell her stories, not of the city or of wars, but of the mountain stars and the quiet rivers of the valley. As the hours passed, Jae-in felt a strange, terrifying heat rising in her chest. It was a red accent of passion she had always suppressed. She looked at his sharp jawline and the intense, protective flicker in his eyes. She realized that she was no longer looking at a pawn or a tool for her revenge. She was looking at a man who saw her soul, not just her bank account. For the first time in her life, the Viper Princess didn't want to fight. She wanted to be held. She realized with a jolt of fear that she was no longer using him. She was falling for him. The warmth of the previous night vanished the moment Jae-in stepped into Nam-gil's private study. She had gone in looking for a spare charger, but the sight of a locked floor safe beneath his desk sparked a cold, familiar suspicion. Her fingers, trained in the art of corporate espionage, worked the dial with practiced ease. When the heavy door clicked open, she didn't find money or weapons. She found a leather-bound ledger. As she flipped through the pages, her breath hitched. The book was a meticulous record of her own life over the last 3 years. Every miracle that had saved the Moon Group was listed here in chilling detail. The day her biggest rival suddenly dropped a lawsuit, there was a note here, target neutralized via port blockade. The time an anonymous investor saved her from bankruptcy, transferred $10 billion through offshore shell company. Even the shipping crisis from last week was there, signed off with a seal she had only heard of in terrifying whispers. The mark of the Godfather. Jae-in felt a wave of nausea. She had prided herself on being a self-made queen, a viper who fought her own battles. But according to this book, she was nothing more than a bird in a golden cage. Every victory she thought she had won through her own brilliance had actually been a gift from a shadow. "You've been busy, Miss Moon." The low, steady voice made her jump. Nam-gil stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light. He didn't look like the humble bodyguard who had held her hand through a nightmare. He looked like the man who owned the ledger and the city. Jae-in slammed the book shut, her eyes blazing with a mix of betrayal and fury. "You've been playing me," she hissed, her voice trembling. "Every move I made, every lucky break, it was you. You weren't protecting me, Nam-gil. You were managing me. Am I just another asset in your portfolio? Is this marriage just a way for the Godfather to take over the Moon Group without firing a single shot?" Nam-gil walked into the room, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He simply looked at the ledger in her hand. "The world is a dangerous place for a woman with your ambition, Jae-in. I didn't manage you. I cleared the path so you could run." "I don't want a path cleared by a ghost," she screamed, tossing the ledger at his feet. "I wanted a husband I could trust, not a puppet master who pulls my strings while I sleep." The red accent of passion she felt only hours ago turned into a deep, bruising purple of resentment. She realized that the man she was falling for was the biggest liar of all. He hadn't just saved her. He had stolen her victory. As she brushed past him, her shoulder hitting his, she realized the war hadn't ended with her marriage. It had only just begun, and this time the enemy was in her own home. The atmosphere at the Moon estate was suffocating. Since the discovery of the ledger, Jae-in had treated Nam-gil like a stranger, but a much larger storm was brewing outside their door. While Jae-in sat in the grand dining hall, trying to focus on corporate documents, the heavy silence was shattered by the sound of wailing sirens. Mrs. Park marched into the hall, her face a mask of fake grief and pointed accusation. Behind her stood several grim-faced police officers. "There she is," Mrs. Park shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Jae-in. She couldn't wait for her grandfather to pass naturally. She poisoned his tea this morning just to speed up the inheritance. Jae-in stood up, her face turning pale. "That's a lie. I haven't even seen grandfather today." "The doctors found a toxin in his system, Jae-in," Mrs. Park sneered, dropping the act as she leaned in close. "And the police found the vial in your bedside drawer. You're finished." The lead officer stepped forward, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Moon Jae-in, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Chairman Moon. Please come with us." Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Jae-in's chest. She looked around the room. Her family had turned their backs, and the law was closing in. For the first time, the Viper Princess felt truly helpless. She looked toward the side door, calculating her chances of running, of escaping the city before the prison gates slammed shut. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't let them take me." A heavy, warm hand landed on her shoulder. Nam-gil stepped out from the shadows behind her chair. He didn't look at the police or the gloating Mrs. Park. He looked only at Jae-in. His eyes were no longer those of the silent servant or the manipulative puppet master. They were the eyes of a fortress. "Don't run, Jae-in," he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble that silenced the room. "Nam-gil, they're going to lock me away," she hissed, trying to pull away. "Mrs. Park is everything rigged." Nam-gil's grip didn't loosen, but it wasn't hurtful. It was grounding. He turned to face the officers, his stature seemingly growing until he dominated the entire hall. The air in the room grew heavy, the kind of pressure that comes before a lightning strike. "Stay," he told her, his gaze shifting back to her with a terrifyingly calm intensity. "Stay right here by my side. I told you before, I am your husband. No one, not the police, not this family, and not the law, can take you from me in this city. I won't allow it." Mrs. Park laughed, a high, mocking sound. "And what are you going to do, bodyguard? Fight the entire precinct?" Nam-gil didn't answer her. He simply pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. "You have 3 minutes to drop these charges," he said to the officers, "or the people who sign your paychecks will be out of a job by dinner."
The morning of the wedding was draped in a deceptive, beautiful fog. Jae-in stood before the tall mirror in the church's dressing room, her reflection looking back at her like a ghost. She wore a gown of intricate white lace, the delicate tiara in her hair marking her as the corporate princess she had always been. But her heart was heavy. This was supposed to be the day she finalized her power. Instead, it felt like she was walking toward a cliff. "You look beautiful, Jae-in," Mrs. Park said, appearing in the doorway. Her smile was sharp, like a shard of glass. "It's a shame this will be the last time the public sees you in anything other than a prison jumpsuit." Jae-in's blood ran cold. She pushed past her stepmother and walked toward the chapel's grand balcony. Below, the church grounds were swarming. It wasn't just wedding guests and photographers. Dozens of black and white police cruisers had blocked every exit. Tactical teams in heavy gear were moving into position, their weapons drawn and focused on the church entrance. Mrs. Park followed her, her voice a low hiss. Chairman Choi found the connection. "Jae-in, your bodyguard is wanted for high-level racketeering. The moment he walks down that aisle, the police will storm the building. We've already filed the emergency board papers. By the time the handcuffs click on his wrists, I will be the permanent chairwoman of Moon Group." Jae-in leaned against the stone railing, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked down at the courtyard, realizing the scale of the trap. Mrs. Park and Chairman Choi had played the long game. They weren't just going to arrest Nam-gil, they were going to use his criminal status to destroy Jae-in's reputation forever. She was a bride trapped in a cage of thorns. "Run, Jae-in," Mrs. Park mocked. "Go tell your little guard to flee. It will only make him look more guilty." The heavy doors of the chapel opened, and the wedding march began to play. The music sounded like a funeral dirge. Jae-in turned and saw Nam-gil standing at the end of a long, floral aisle. He looked magnificent in his dark suit, his gaze fixed on her with a calm that bordered on terrifying. He didn't look like a man about to be arrested. He looked like a man who was waiting for the world to start its final act. Jae-in stood frozen, her lace veil fluttering in the breeze. She wanted to scream, to tell him to run, to save himself. But as their eyes met, Nam-gil gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He knew. He had always known. As she took her first step toward him, she realized this wasn't just a wedding anymore. It was an execution, and she didn't know yet whose head was on the block. The heavy church doors groaned as they were flung open, but it wasn't the tactical teams that rushed in. Instead, a line of black-suited men entered with a precision that made the air turn cold. At the front were the most powerful figures in the country: the chief of police, the city mayor, and 3 billionaires whose faces were on every news channel. Mrs. Park let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. "There they are. Arrest him. Arrest the criminal who infiltrated our family." She stepped forward, pointing a trembling, eager finger at Nam-gil. "Take him away and end this circus." But the officers didn't move toward the groom. The chief of police stepped onto the altar, his face pale and sweating. He didn't reach for his handcuffs. Instead, he snapped his heels together and bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the marble floor. Behind him, the mayor and the billionaires followed suit, their heads bowed in absolute, terrifying reverence. "We humbly apologize for the delay, sir," the chief's voice echoed through the silent chapel. "The city is under your command. Every threat has been cleared as per your instructions." Jae-in stood frozen, her lace veil caught in the sudden draft. She looked at the men who held the city's laws in their hands, then back at Nam-gil. He didn't look surprised. He stood with his shoulders broad and his gaze piercing, no longer the humble guard, but the true master of the world. The Godfather wasn't just a title. He was the law. Mrs. Park's face drained of all color. What is this? He's a bodyguard. He's a nobody." Nam-gil didn't even glance at her. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small, silver digital recorder. He turned to Jae-in, his expression softening for the first time. "I told you I would give you the world, Jae-in," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "But first, I'll give you the truth." He pressed play. The church speakers crackled to life, filled with the recorded voices of Mrs. Park and Chairman Choi discussing the night they cut the brakes on her father's car. The confession was absolute. It was the sound of their empire crumbling. "My men have already secured the original evidence," Nam-gil said, stepping toward her. "The people who took your father from you will never see the sun again." Jae-in felt the weight of her 3-year war lift from her shoulders. She looked at the man she had bought for $1, realizing he had spent millions and risked everything just to be the shadow that protected her. The world was bowing to him, but his eyes were only bowing to her. She wasn't just a bride anymore. She was the queen of a kingdom she never knew he owned. The silence in the chapel was heavy, but it was no longer the silence of a grave. It was the silence of a new beginning. Jae-in looked down at the recording in her hand, the evidence that finally cleared her father's name and crushed her enemies. She looked at the mayor, and the billionaire still bowed low on the marble floor. Then, she looked at Nam-gil. The anger she had felt when she discovered his secret ledger had completely evaporated. She realized now that his control wasn't a cage. It was a shield. He hadn't manipulated her because he wanted her power. He had stayed in the shadows because he wanted her to be the one to step into the light. He had played the servant, so she could remain a queen. "You did all of this for me," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and realization. "I told you, Jae-in," Nam-gil said, his voice dropping to a private, tender warmth. "My loyalty cannot be bought. I chose you 10 years ago, and I will choose you every day for the rest of my life." Jae-in turned toward the crowd of stunned socialites and the cowering Mrs. Park, who was already being led away in handcuffs by the very officers she had summoned. Jae-in didn't look like a victim anymore. She stood tall, her white lace gown flowing behind her like a royal cape. She wasn't just the heir to the Moon Group. She was the partner of the man who owned the horizon. She reached out and took Nam-gil's hand, but this time, she didn't lead him. They stood side by side, equal in power and purpose. "The Moon Group is mine," Jae-in announced to the room, her voice clear and commanding. "And this city is ours." As they walked out of the church, the police sirens were replaced by the respectful cheers of the people outside. The Viper Princess had finally won her war, but she hadn't done it by staying cold and alone. She had done it by trusting the man who was both her sword and her heart. The sun broke through the morning fog, lighting up the city below them. They stood on the stone steps of the church, looking out over their empire. Behind them, the world continued to bow. To the public, he was still the bodyguard who had made the ultimate climb. To the underworld, he was still the Godfather who ruled with an iron fist. But to each other, they were finally home. The contract was gone, the $1 debt was paid, and the king and queen of the city were ready to begin their reign.